Let's talk about the camera that I've been using since March, but for whatever reason decided to wait until August to review, the Sony a7C. I'm going to tell you what it is, why I bought it, things I like about it, and things I dislike about it. The Sony a7C is a full-frame camera in an APS-C style body. It's not actually compact, but it happens to be in the style of the a6000 cameras that we call compact. I think its size is overly advertised because it's not much smaller than what you're going to get in a typical A7 body. YouTubers say it makes a great B cam because it's supposedly a small full-frame camera that they could throw into their kit, but I think that's nonsense, and it's probably coming from the same crowd that bought the silver version for its novelty without realizing that following the 85% of the crowd that did that automatically made buying the silver version not novel. Tangent over. Even if it were significantly smaller, attaching almost any full-frame lens, like this beast right here, would pretty much defeat the purpose of trying to go compact anyway. The only exception would be the line of small prime lenses that Sony released around the time they released the a7C, but then you'd have to carry a bunch of those with you if you want to cover all of your desired zoom ranges, or focal lengths, whatever the proper term would be. See, I'm not exactly a photography nerd, which is probably why a lot of you actually watch this, because you know that I'm not like one of those people who's gonna, delve deep into the science and lingo of these cameras. And that apparently makes me relatable to some of you. It's the irony of YouTube. Knowing less actually is what makes you relatable.
I'm learning.
Alright, let's talk about why I bought the camera. I bought the camera mostly for hybrid outdoor shooting, so bucket list photography, i.e. premeditated photography, most outdoor vlogging and video shooting, and most indoor vlogging where I don't need to be discreet. You just imagine walking through a supermarket trying to be discreet with this on you. So throughout 2020 I used the Canon 90D as my primary camera, as you could probably tell by the numerous review videos I've done on that camera that I've posted to this channel. In December 2020, I bought a Sony a6600 after realizing that it seemed like Sony listens to content creators a little bit more, though I am still holding out hope for Canon and Sony to sort of push each other forward in this space. And so between December 2020 and March 2021, I used the Sony a6600, and in late February, that is when I bought the a7C to replace both of my previous two cameras. So in February, when I decided I wanted to get a full-frame mirrorless camera, I decided to get the a7C because I got tired of waiting for an a7 IV announcement, and I'm glad I did not wait any longer because it sounds like Sony is delaying that even further, which sort of confirms the suspicions that I've had all year that they're not really in any hurry to replace the still popular a7 III. And the release of the a7C, which is basically an a7 3.5, pretty much guarantees that Sony is going to be in no hurry to make an a7 IV announcement, especially if they're still getting a lot of sales from the a7 III and the a7C. So here's some things I like about the camera based on my personal needs and wants. It's one of the best value Sony full-frame cameras, and probably one of the best value full-frame cameras overall on the market, with the body coming in at around $1,800. The first feature I should mention is the fully articulating flip-out screen, which is not only a must for vloggers, but also comes in handy if you're doing any kind of shooting where you're not directly behind the camera. Then there's the oversampled 4K at up to 30 frames per second with autofocus. When you're a resolution junkie like me, hearing both oversampled and 4K is music to my ears. And when it comes to frame rate, I'm part of YouTube's pretentious 24 frames per second club, even though in the digital age there is no frame rate that's inherently better than another, except for the fact that I prefer to edit on a 24 frames per second timeline, which I guess is all that really matters if you're a content creator. Then there's unlimited record time. Now, truthfully, record time limits aren't really an issue with vlogging cameras because you're rarely going to ever vlog a clip that's over the typical 30-minute record limit that you see in a lot of DSLR bodies. But the Sony a6600's unlimited record time spoiled me, and the unlimited record time is one of the reasons why I dipped into the Sony ecosystem, so there's that. And of course I like the fact that this is a full-frame camera. Back in February I decided it was finally time to give into the full-frame image quality hype. Now, I have to be honest with you, I do notice an uptick in the quality in the photographs that I've taken throughout this year, but even though I am somewhat of a nerd outside of the field of photography, I'm not enough of a nerd within the field of photography to definitively tell you if that improvement has more to do with equipment or if it has to do with a natural progression that simply comes with practicing something often. Now let's talk about that megapixel sweet spot. And for this camera's full frame sensor, it comes in at 24.2 megapixels. For me, the sweet spot is somewhere in the 20s or 30s. Anything under 20 megapixels is probably not going to be crisp enough for my taste. Anything over 40 megapixels is probably going to introduce a little bit too much noise in low light situations where you're not using expensive wide aperture primes. And speaking of primes, that leads me to my next need, which is a camera that gives me access to a wide range of compelling lenses, even though I'm still too cheap to buy almost any of them. I mean, sure, just about every major camera manufacturer has plenty of lenses to choose from, but this is especially true with Sony's E-mount due to all of the third-party lenses that you could use. That includes brands like Tamron and Sigma and whatever ones that I can't think of off the top of my head. This is not to mention you can also use full-frame Canon EF glass on the E-mount using a Sigma MC11 mount converter lens adapter. I'm actually using the adapter right now on the Sony a6600 you're looking at me through. The adapter is what enabled me to continue using the EF mount Sigma 18 to 35mm art lens that I used when the Canon 90D was my do-it-all camera. So if you switch to Sony from another system, chances are you'll still have access to almost all of the lenses that you want to use, no matter what mount they're native to. In case you're wondering what lens I use for the Sony a7C, I use the FE 24 to 105mm GOSS lens that I bought with a bundle. It's a great all-purpose lens that basically keeps me from having to change lenses basically ever, but it's also pretty massive. And lastly, I like the tap to focus on the a7C because it comes in handy for pretty much any behind-the-camera photography or video. So let's talk about things I don't like about the Sony a7C, and one of those things is definitely the image stabilization for video. Descriptions of this camera claim it has 5-axis image stabilization, but after months of using this camera, I'm convinced that it's only for stills and not for video. Here's what happens when I turn the steady shot off on the lens and use whatever stabilization is supposedly in the camera. It's difficult to get usable handheld footage even when you keep the lens's steady shot on, and if you're someone like me who likes to do things mostly handheld, you don't want to have to lug around a tripod or a gimbal every time you want to get usable footage. Unfortunately, on some of my bigger personal video projects, I've had to lug around my obnoxious tripod because I can't trust the steady shot in the lens that is probably optimized for photography and not video. Another gripe that I have with this camera is that Sony mirrorless camera sensors are unprotected from dust because there is no flap that comes down to protect it when it's unused. That means dust could come in and ruin your shots and you won't even know it until you come home to review the footage after a full day of shooting. This happened to me twice. After the first time I thought it was lens dust, so I cleaned the lens, did a quick video test and thought I fixed it, but then I went to shoot a second day and the dust spots were on my footage again. Sure enough, when I took off the lens to look at the sensor, I noticed that a couple of hairs of dust had gotten onto it even though I basically never take off the lens. Thankfully, number one, that these blowers exist, which you should keep with you at all times. And thankfully, number two, a YouTuber who goes by the name Matt Johnson has a tutorial for how to use Premiere Pro to remove dust spots from your videos, and I'll link that below. The Sony a7C is definitely good enough for any casual hobbyist shooter, and probably even overkill for some. The best way I could describe it is that it's a typical Raymond camera that's cut from the same cloth as each of the two previous cameras that I used as my primary cameras, the Canon 90D and the Sony a6600. Like those two cameras, the a7C is nothing special and doesn't do any one thing exceptionally well, but like those other two cameras, it does almost everything fairly well.